Back in the hard winter of 1874, out in the Wyoming Territory, a woman's value was often weighed in gold dust. But a child's life? That could be traded for less than a bottle of cheap whiskey. When the gavel hit the table in the smoky back room of the Blackwater Trading Post, Sarah Miller didn't cry out or plead. She just held her baby brother so tight her knuckles went bone white and watched the filthy money pass from one hand to the other. She figured a monster would come to collect them. She braced herself for cruelty. What she never expected was the giant, scarred man who brought them to look at the shivering infant and say, "Son, you need to put your coat on. You're both my family now." This story, as true as the ground beneath your feet, is about how a moment of shame became a legendary love. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The air inside the Gilded Spur Saloon stunk of old tobacco, unwashed men, and pure hopelessness. It was late October in the Dakota foothills, and the wind outside was already screaming, promising a blizzard that would surely claim the weak. Inside, the heat was thick enough to choke on, but all Sarah Miller could feel was a deep cold that rattled her soul. She was pushed into a corner, her back against the rough-cut pine wall, trying to shield the small bundle in her arms. Liam, just 6 months old, was finally sleeping. His tiny, pale face was nestled against the worn-out wool of Sarah's one and only coat. At the main table sat her stepfather, Elias Vane. Elias was a small-time man, with shifty eyes and a spirit eaten away by rye whiskey. He was holding a poker hand he swore was a winner, but the sweat popping on his lip told the real story. Across from him sat Cyrus Reed, a cattle baron known all the way from Deadwood to Cheyenne, for two things: his mountains of money and his complete lack of a heart. "You're all out of chips, Vane," Cyrus rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. He leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs into a silk vest that was far too fancy for a place filled with sawdust and spittoons. "And your credit's no good here. The bank took your farm this morning. You ain't got nothing." I got prospects," Elias stammered, his eyes flitting around the room, searching for a hero who was never going to show up. "You have nothing," Cyrus said again, sliding a heavy Colt revolver right onto the center of the table. "Unless you're looking to pay your debt with blood." The whole saloon fell silent. The piano player, a young fellow named Jericho, froze in the middle of a tune. Even the bartender, a big old brute they called Big Jim, stopped wiping a glass to see what would happen. Elias's panicked eyes swept across the room until they finally landed on Sarah. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She knew that look. It was the same one he gave her mother's jewelry right before he sold it. It was the look of a man taking stock of his goods. "No," Sarah whispered, but the word caught in her throat. "I got the girl," Elias said, his voice shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's strong. 19 years old, can read and write, cooks better than anyone in this whole territory, and she's untouched." A low murmur went through the crowd. Men turned to stare, their eyes hungry, sizing her up. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter over Liam, trying her best to just disappear into the wall. Cyrus Reed turned his head slow-like, his cold, reptilian eyes seeming to strip her bare. "And the baby, her brother," Elias added in a rush. "Throw him in too. A package deal. Just clear my debt, Cyrus. $500. "She ain't worth 500, a man yelled from the back. "I'll give you 50 and a mule." The room filled with cruel laughter. It had turned into a marketplace. A slave market, plain and simple, happening right in front of the town's useless sheriff, J.D. Tutt, who was passed out drunk at the bar. Cyrus looked over at Sarah, a mean little smile on his face. "I do need a housekeeper out at the ranch. Someone to look after the boys. 300 for the girl and the crying baggage." "Done!" Elias yelled, pure relief flooding his pathetic face. Done. Take them. Cyrus stood, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. He started walking towards Sarah, his boots making heavy thuds on the wooden planks. He reached out a hand, his fingers covered in gold rings, getting ready to grab her arm. Don't you touch me, Sarah hissed, stumbling backward. You're my property now, girl, Cyrus sneered. Thud. A huge, gloved hand came down hard on Sarah's shoulder, stopping her right in her tracks. But it wasn't Cyrus. Sarah looked up and then up some more. Standing right behind her was a man she hadn't even seen come in. He was as big as a mountain, wearing a coat made from bear hide that still smelled like the wild. His beard was dark and full, with melting snowflakes caught in it. A nasty scar ran from his temple down to his jaw where it vanished into his beard. He smelled like pine trees, gun oil, and the cold mountain air. The room went dead quiet. This was Silas Mercer. Everybody knew the name, but not many had ever seen him up close. He was a trapper who lived way up in the Bitterroot Mountains, only coming to town twice a year. Folks whispered he'd killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a knife. They also whispered he'd lost his mind a long time ago. Silas didn't even look at Sarah. His eyes were fixed on Cyrus Reed. Step away, Silas said. His voice was lower than Cyrus's, but it had a power to it that seemed to make the floorboards hum. This is a private matter, Mercer, Cyrus spat, though he did take a small step back. I just bought 'em. You bought a debt, Silas corrected him. He walked right past Sarah, moving with the quiet grace of a wolf, and went straight to the table. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a thick leather pouch. He dropped it on the table. The sound it made, a heavy, dull thud, told everyone it was full of solid gold, not just dust. 700, Silas said. Gold coin, not credit. Elias Vane's eyes nearly popped out of his head. $700 was a king's ransom. It was enough to start over somewhere new, or to drink himself to death in high style. Sold, Elias hollered before Cyrus could even say a word. To Mr. Mercer. Cyrus's face turned a deep shade of red. Now you hold on. I had me a deal. Silas turned his head, his hand resting easy-like on the handle of a huge Bowie knife on his hip. The auction's over, Reed, unless you want to start bidding with lead. Cyrus looked at the pouch of gold, then at the size of Silas Mercer, and finally at all the men who were watching him. He spat on the floor. Fine, take her. She's too skinny to last the winter anyway. Both of them will likely freeze to death before you even reach the timberline. Silas didn't give him an answer. He walked back over to Sarah. Up close, his eyes were a shocking, clear gray, like the sky right before a big snowstorm. He looked at the trembling woman and then down at the little bundle where Liam had started to fuss. Sarah tensed up. She waited for him to grab her to start barking orders about her duties. But instead, Silas just reached out and gently adjusted the blanket around Liam's tiny head, blocking the draft from the door. Wrap him up tight, Silas said. His voice was rough, but there was no meanness in it. The wind's picking up. We're leaving now. Leaving? Sarah whispered. Where? Home, Silas said, before the past snows over. He turned and walked right out into the storm, just expecting her to follow him. And since she had no other choice in the world, Sarah Miller stepped out of that saloon and into a life she could not imagine. The town of Blackwater Creek vanished into a blur of white behind them in less than an hour. Silas Mercer didn't travel by carriage. He had 2 enormous horses, some kind of Clydesdale mix that looked strong enough to pull down a mountain. He also had a pack mule loaded down with supplies. He lifted Sarah up onto one of the horses, a mare he called Bess, and then helped fix Liam into a special leather carrier on Sarah's chest. Just hold on to the pommel, he told her, after checking the saddle strap. Bess knows her way. Don't fight her. For the first 4 hours, neither of them said a word. The only sounds were the crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow and the whistle of the wind through the tall fir trees. The ground changed from the muddy mess of the lowlands to the pure, deadly white of the high country. Sarah's mind was spinning. Who was this man? $700 was a crazy amount of money. Men didn't pay that much for a housekeeper. They paid that kind of coin for a champion horse or for a wife. The thought made her feel sick to her stomach. Elias had sold her, plain and simple. She now belonged to this man. She watched him riding just ahead of her. He sat straight in the saddle, his head always turning, watching the tree line. He had a Winchester rifle in a sheath right by his knee, and he looked like he was as much a part of this wilderness as the giant granite rocks sticking out of the snow. As the sun started to sink, painting long purple shadows on the ground, the temperature dropped hard. Sarah started to shiver, a deep rattling shiver she couldn't control. Her coat, a hand-me-down from her mother, was thin and full of holes. Silas pulled his horse to a stop. He swung down and walked back to her. Without saying anything, he unbuckled his heavy bear fur coat. "I'm fine," Sarah chattered, her pride fighting against the freezing cold. "You're freezing," Silas said, like it was the simplest fact in the world. "And if you freeze, the boy freezes." He draped the giant coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, maybe 20 pounds, and it immediately wrapped her in a blanket of warmth. It smelled like him, like campfire smoke and pine needles. Underneath it, he just wore a thick wool shirt and a buckskin vest. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled by the thick fur collar. "Why did you buy us?" Silas looked at her, his gray eyes impossible to read. He fiddled with the stirrup on her saddle. "Elias Vane is a pig. He would have sold you to a cat house in Deadwood as soon as Reed's money was gone." "So you saved me?" Sarah asked, and a little spark of hope lit up inside her. "I needed someone," Silas said, his voice flat. "And I don't trust the women from town. They talk too much." He got back on his horse and nudged it forward. The little hope in Sarah's chest flickered and died. So he really did just want a servant. Or maybe something worse. They made camp that night in a shallow cave out of the wind. Silas built a fire like he'd done it 1,000 times, the flames jumping up to light the cave walls. He cooked up some salt pork and beans in a skillet and handed her a tin plate to Sarah. "Eat," he said. "You are going to need the fat." Sarah ate like she was starving. She made a mash from hard biscuit and water for Liam, rocking the little one until he fell asleep. When she finally looked up, Silas was cleaning his rifle, and the firelight was dancing on the steel. He asked without looking at her, "You got a name?" "Sarah," she told him. "And this is Liam." Silas repeated the name. Liam, as if he was testing the sound of it. "That is a strong Irish name." "My father was," Sarah said. "He died in the mines 3 years back." Silas murmured, "The mines have a way of taking good men." He snapped the rifle's action shut. "Get some sleep, Sarah. We have to cross the Devil's Backbone tomorrow. If we are not over it, by noon, a big storm is going to catch us." Sarah asked, "Where are we heading?" "Grizzly Peak." Silas pointed his chin toward the darkest, tallest shape against the star-filled sky. "My cabin is up on the North Ridge." "But that is miles up there," Sarah gasped. "Nobody lives that high." "I do," Silas said. He unrolled his bedroll on the other side of the fire. "Sleep." He turned his back to her, but Sarah did not close her eyes. She watched him, her hand wrapped tight around a small, sharp rock she had found. She promised herself that if he came anywhere near her, she would use it. But Silas Mercer did not move a muscle. He slept like a man made of stone. And yet Sarah felt certain that if a tiny twig snapped a mile away, he would be awake with that rifle in his hand before the sound could even fade. Crossing the Devil's Backbone was a true nightmare of wind and ice. The trail was hardly 2 feet wide, with a straight drop of 1,000 feet on one side. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, putting her trust in the horse to find its footing. Liam started crying from the change in the air, a tiny thin wail that the howling wind just swallowed right up. Silas was a machine. He led the horses by hand, kicking steps into the ice with his own boots for them to follow. He never once slipped. He never even hesitated. He was like a force of nature, fighting the mountain itself and winning. By the time they finally got to the flat plateau, Sarah was tired beyond all words. But then she saw it. This was not the little shack she had been expecting. It was a fortress built from timber and stone. The cabin was huge, made from massive logs sealed with white clay. A stone chimney puffed gray smoke high into the sky. There was a barn, a smokehouse, and even a corral. It all sat in a valley shaped like a bowl, protected by towering cliffs, like a small oasis in that frozen wasteland. "We are here!" Silas yelled over the sound of the wind. They rode straight into the barn, and the feeling of being out of that wind made Sarah feel dizzy. Silas helped her get down from the horse. Her legs, numb from the cold and the long ride, just gave out from under her. He caught her with no trouble, his hands feeling large and firm around her waist. For just a moment they were standing close. Sarah looked up into his face. The scar on it was jagged and ugly, but his eyes were surprisingly gentle. He set her back on her feet and then took a step back right away. "Go on inside," he said, pointing to the cabin. "The door is not locked. The fire should still have some embers. I will take care of the animals." Sarah stumbled her way toward the cabin. She pushed the heavy oak door open and let out a gasp. It was warm inside. The floor was covered with braided rugs. There were bookshelves, real bookshelves, and they were filled with books bound in leather. A rocking chair sat right by the hearth. The whole place was clean, orderly, and smelled like cedar wood. She walked over to the fire, stirred the embers, and put another log on. The heat washed right over her. She unwrapped little Liam, who blinked his blue eyes and made a soft sound. "We are okay, Liam," she whispered, and she kissed his forehead. "We are going to be okay." The door opened and Silas came in, stomping the snow off his boots. He was carrying 2 large saddlebags. He dropped them onto the table. "There is water in the barrel," he said. "Flour and sugar are in the pantry, and there is dried meat down in the cellar." He took his coat off and hung it on a wooden peg. He looked at Sarah, who was still standing by the fire, her hand clutching that rock in her pocket. "You can let go of the rock now, Sarah," Silas said in a quiet voice. Sarah froze solid. "What?" "The rock you have in your pocket," Silas said, pouring some water into a basin to wash up. "I saw you pick it up last night. I heard you holding onto it the entire ride." Slowly, Sarah pulled her hand out of her pocket. You did not say anything about it." "I figure a woman in your spot has every right to be scared," Silas said, drying his face with a rough towel. He turned to look straight at her. "So let us get things straight right now. I bought you because I live up here all alone, and this winter is going to be the hardest one in 10 years. I need some help. I need somebody to cure the hides, cook the meals, and keep the fire going while I'm out on the trap line." He took one step closer, his face looking stern. "I did not buy a wife. I bought a partner for the work. You will sleep in the loft. I will sleep down here. You do your part of the work, and you and the boy will eat. If you try to run, the wolves will get you long before you ever reach the tree line. Do we have an understanding?" Sarah looked right at him. She saw the hard lines on his face, but she also saw that he was telling the truth. He was not like Elias. He was not Cyrus Reed. He was something else completely. "We have an understanding," Sarah said, and her voice was steady. "Good," Silas nodded. He walked to a bookshelf and took down a small wooden box. He tossed it to her. Sarah caught it. It was heavy. She opened it. Inside were 20 gold coins. "That is your pay for the first 6 months," Silas said. "Paid to you in advance. If you're still here come springtime, you can use it to leave if that is what you want." Sarah just stared at the gold. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. Why? Because you are not a slave, Sarah, Silas said, turning back toward the door. I am going out to check the perimeter. Supper will be at sundown. He walked out of the cabin, leaving Sarah standing by the fire. She held the gold in her hand and felt a strange kind of warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing at all to do with the hearth. For the first few weeks, they settled into a routine. It was a life filled with hard work. Sarah scrubbed and cooked and mended clothes. Silas would disappear before the sun came up and come back after it was dark, often dragging a deer or a couple of rabbits with him. They hardly ever spoke, but the silence was not unfriendly anymore. It was comfortable. Sarah started to notice little things. She noticed how Silas would sit by the firelight and carve small wooden animals for Liam. She noticed how he would always take the burnt piece of bread so that she could have the soft one. But that piece was a fragile thing. One evening in the middle of November, Sarah was sweeping the floor near the large trunk at the foot of Silas's bed. The lid was sitting just a little bit crooked. Now, curiosity is a dangerous thing, a real biting thing, and it got a hold of her. She took the end of her broom and nudged the chest open. Inside, laying right on top of some old wool blankets, was one of those old-timey photographs in a silver frame. It was a younger Silas, before the scar, and he was smiling. A beautiful woman with laughing eyes sat next to him, and she held a baby boy in her lap. Sarah picked it up, feeling a deep ache in her heart. He had a family. Put that back. The voice was a low growl. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the picture. Silas was standing right there in the doorway, with snow melting on his shoulders. His face looked like a thundercloud. "I was just sweeping," Sarah stammered out. The lid was already open. Silas walked across that room in 2 long steps. He snatched the photograph right out of her hand, his touch rough and angry. For just a heartbeat, Sarah was sure he was going to hit her. She couldn't help but flinch away. Silas saw it. He saw her flinch, and he just froze. The anger in his eyes seemed to break into a million pieces, and all that was left was a deep, jagged pain. He looked down at the picture, then back at Sarah, and then over to where Liam was playing on the rug. "Her name was Mary," Silas whispered, and his voice cracked. "And the boy, he was Thomas. They died 4 years ago. Smallpox." "I am so sorry," Sarah said softly. "I did not know." "That is why I live up here," Silas said, placing the photograph gently back in the trunk and then locking it. "The sickness cannot climb this high. People cannot climb this high." He turned to her and his eyes looked haunted. "But trouble always finds a way to get up the mountain. I saw some tracks today, 3 shod horses." Sarah's blood ran cold in her veins. "Who?" "I am not sure," Silas said. He walked to the window and peered out into the darkness that was gathering outside. But they were scouting, looking for a way up the backbone. He turned back to her, and his hand was resting on his Colt revolver. "Somebody's coming for you, Sarah, and I do not think they are coming here to buy you." The snow fell even harder that night, like a white curtain that cut them off from the rest of the world. But the warmth inside the cabin had all disappeared. Silas paced back and forth on the floorboards, and his heavy boots made a tense rhythm. He cleaned his Winchester rifle for the 3rd time, checking the action. Then he would move to the window and just stare out into the black nothingness. Sarah sat by the fire, with Liam asleep in the cradle that Silas had carved. The gold coins in the box felt heavy in her pocket, a reminder of a freedom she thought she had. But the fear she had heard in Silas's voice earlier had chained her to this mountain far more tightly than any debt ever could. "Who would come all this way?" Sarah asked, finally breaking the long silence. "Elias sold us. The debt should be paid." "Cyrus Reed. He would not come all this way for a housekeeper he never even wanted." Silas stopped his pacing. He turned and looked at her, and the firelight caught the silver in his beard. "Men like Reed do not like to lose. But this is not about Reed. Those tracks, they were from military shod horses. That means cavalry, mounts, or men who used to be in the cavalry. Sarah frowned. The army? Why would the army care about us? Silas walked over to the table and poured himself a cup of coffee that was as black and thick as tar. I do not know, but I sure am planning to find out. The answer showed up 2 days later. It did not come with a loud bang, but with a stranger collapsing right at the edge of the tree line. Silas had been outside chopping wood when he saw the figure stumble out from a snowdrift and fall face first into the snow. He did not rush over. He watched for a full minute with his rifle raised, checking to see if it was in fair ambush. When he saw nothing, he finally moved. He dragged the man into the barn. It was Jericho, the piano player from the Gilded Spur Saloon. The young man was half frozen. His fingers were blue, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. Sarah rushed in with blankets and some hot broth. "Jericho, how did you get here?" Jericho coughed, and his whole body shook with shivers. He grabbed Sarah's arm with a strength she did not know he had. "You have to run." "Why?" Silas asked, his voice hard as stone. "Who is tracking us?" "Not Reed," Jericho wheezed out. "It is the Pinkertons, detectives from back east, from Chicago." Sarah's mind was spinning. Pinkertons? Out here for her? She thought, I have not ever been east of the Mississippi River. Jericho just shook his head, his gaze falling on the small bundle Sarah had left near the door. "Liam," he said, "they are not here for you, Sarah. They are here for the baby." The quiet in that barn suddenly felt heavier than all the snow piled up on the roof. "You had better start explaining," Silas demanded, taking a step toward them. "Elias, he had too much to drink," Jericho said in a low voice. "After you rode out, he started running his mouth about the boy, and about where he truly came from. He did not find Liam in some orphanage, Sarah, and that boy is not your brother." The whole world started to tilt, and Sarah had to reach out and grab a stall door just to keep her balance. "What are you talking about, my mother? She was the one who brought him home. She told me he was a late blessing from the Lord." "Your mother was a fine woman," Jericho said, with tears starting to well up in his eyes. "But she was mighty scared of Elias. About 6 months back, Elias stumbled upon a woman, a wealthy woman, who was dying in a carriage wreck on the old post road. Her driver was already gone. She was just holding on to the baby. She gave Elias a locket and begged him to take the boy to his father up in Boston, and then she passed on." Jericho took in a shaky breath. "Elias took that locket, sold it for cash, and then he took the baby. He told your mother the boy was just a stray he had found. But the locket, well, the man in town who bought it knew the crest on it. It belongs to the Harrington family, the railroad tycoons. They have been searching high and low for their heir." Sarah looked down at Liam, who was sleeping so soundly in his little sling. "He is an heir?" "He is worth millions of dollars," Jericho said. "And the man who is on his way here, a hired gun by the name of Cade, he is working for the uncle, the one who gets every last penny if that baby is never found." Silas let out a soft curse under his breath. If the uncle only gets the money if the baby is gone, then Cade is not coming to rescue him. He is coming here to kill him. Jericho confirmed it, his voice barely a whisper. "He has 5 men with him, and they are hard men. They were down at the trading post asking folks about a mountain man with a scar." Silas stood up straight, his face turning into a cold mask of pure anger. He looked over at Sarah. The housekeeper, the servant girl he had bought, she was gone. In her place was a woman who was terrified for a child she loved like he was her very own. "He is my brother," Sarah said with a fire in her voice, pulling Liam in close. "I do not care one bit about the money. He is mine. He is ours," Silas corrected her gently. He turned to the wall where his old trapping gear was hanging. He took down a heavy double-barreled shotgun and a bandolier full of shells. "Jericho, are you able to shoot?" Silas asked. "My hands," Jericho said, looking down at his frost-bitten fingers. "I do not reckon I will be playing the piano anymore, but I can still pull a trigger." "Good," Silas said. Sarah, you take the boy down to the cellar. Bar the door, and you do not open it unless you hear my voice. My voice, exactly. What are you going to do? Sarah asked, holding Liam tight. Silas walked over to the big barn doors and pushed them open. The storm had finally passed. The sun was going down, painting all the snow in shades of blood red. I'm going to introduce Mr. Conincade to the mountain, Silas said. And this mountain does not take kindly to trespassers. Conincade showed up about 3 hours after the sun went down. He was a professional, all right. He did not just ride up the main trail. He sent 2 of his men to circle around the back ridge trying to get a high spot to shoot down into the cabin. He kept 3 men with him, coming up slow from the tree line and using the shadows to hide. But Silas Mercer knew every rock, every tree, and every change in the wind on Grizzly Peak. He had prepared the ground. The first scream sliced through the quiet night like a razor. It came from up on the ridge. One of the flankers had walked right into a bear trap Silas had hidden under a snowdrift. The heavy iron jaws snapped shut on the man's leg, crushing the bone. "Stay down," Silas hissed. He was lying flat on the cabin roof, wrapped in a white sheet that made him invisible against the snow. He kept his Winchester rifle steady. Down below, in the tree line, a muzzle flashed in the dark. A bullet slammed into the logs of the cabin. Silas fired back in an instant. He did not aim for the flash. He aimed for where the man was likely to move after taking his shot. A shadow just crumpled in the trees. "That is one," Silas counted to himself. "Mercer," a voice called out from the darkness. It was a smooth, educated voice, but it was dripping with pure menace. "Conincade, there is no need for any of this. Just hand over the child. You can even keep the girl. We will leave you the gold. You come and get him," Silas yelled back. Another round of gunfire exploded. Bullets broke through the windows. Down in the cellar, Sarah was huddled in the dark, with her hands covering Liam's ears, just praying. She could hear the heavy sound of boots stomping on the porch and the sound of shattering glass. Jericho was over at the kitchen window, firing an old rusty revolver blindly out into the night. "They're getting closer, Silas." "I know," Silas muttered. He slid off the back of the roof, landing without a sound in the deep snow. He moved like a phantom, circling around the cabin. He found the second flanker trying to pry open the back door. The man never even heard him coming. Silas hit him hard with the butt of his rifle. The man went down, but Conincade was a clever one. He had used the noise as a distraction to rush the front porch. The door burst open with a loud crash. Silas sprinted. He dove right through the broken kitchen window just as Conincade and another one of his gunmen stepped into the main room. "Clear the room!" Conincade shouted. Jericho popped his head up from behind an overturned table and fired. His shot went wild, but it made Conincade duck for cover. Conincade fired back, and his bullet caught Jericho in the shoulder. The young man spun around and fell, letting out a groan. "Jericho!" Sarah screamed from underneath the floorboards. "Shut up!" Conincade roared, pointing his pistol right at the floor. "Come on out, girl, or I will start burning this whole place to the ground." Silas rose up from the shadows of the kitchen. He did not have a clean shot at Conincade without taking a chance on hitting the trap door where Sarah and Liam were hiding. He dropped his rifle and pulled out his Bowie knife. The sound of the steel sliding from its sheath was a quiet, metallic whisper that Conincade heard. Conincade spun around. "Mercer, you are a hard man to kill." "You are on my land," Silas said, his voice low and shaking with rage, "and you threatened my family." Conincade just laughed. "Family? A woman you bought and a stolen bastard child." "My family," Silas roared, and he lunged forward. The gunman with Conincade raised his rifle. But Silas was just too fast. He grabbed the barrel, twisted it away, and drove his knee hard into the man's stomach, sending him flying into the fireplace. Conincade fired. The bullet grazed Silas's ribs, feeling like a line of fire across his side. But Silas did not stop. He tackled Conincade, slamming him back into the heavy oak table. The table splintered into pieces. They rolled around on the floor, a tangle of arms and legs and pure fury. Conincade was younger and faster. He managed to get a forearm across Silas's throat, pinning him down. "It is over, old man. The money is mine." Silas's vision started to get spotty. He could not get a breath. The weight of all his years, the cold, the wound, it was all catching up to him at once. "This is it," he thought. "I failed them." Bang! The sound was deafening inside that small room. Cade's eyes went wide. He slumped forward and his grip went slack. Silas shoved the body off of him and took a huge gasp of air. He looked up. Sarah was standing at the top of the cellar stairs. She was holding the heavy Colt revolver that Silas had left on the table earlier. Her hands were shaking something fierce, but her eyes were wide open. She had climbed out when she heard Silas struggling. She had made the choice to fight. "Sarah," Silas wheezed, trying to sit up. She dropped the gun and ran to him, falling down on her knees. "You are bleeding. Oh, Lord, you are bleeding." "I am fine," Silas grunted as he checked the wound. "It is just a scratch. Is the boy safe?" "He is asleep," Sarah sobbed, pressing her forehead against his chest. "He slept right through the whole thing." Silas wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving him feeling tired down to his bones. But he felt something else, too. A fierce, burning pride. "You did good, Sarah," he whispered. "You did real good." The silence came back to the mountain. The wind howled outside, but the sound of gunfire had finally stopped. Silas slowly got to his feet, pulling Sarah up with him. He went to check on Jericho, who was pale but awake. "You will live, kid," Silas said, tossing a roll of bandages to him. "But your days of playing piano in a saloon are over." "I did not care for the tips anyway," Jericho grimaced. Silas walked to the door and looked out at the mess. The falling snow was already covering the bodies. It was over. But he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that it was not really over. Men like Cade do not work alone. The Harrington family was powerful. If the uncle wanted that child gone, he would just send more men, a whole army the next time. He closed the door and slid the heavy bar across it. He turned to Sarah, who was holding Liam again, rocking him gently by the fire. "We cannot stay here," Silas said, his voice heavy. "Not anymore. They know where we are." Sarah looked up at him, and the fear came back into her eyes. "Where can we go?" "The pass is blocked by snow." Silas walked to the old trunk, the one that held the picture of his dead wife. He opened it up again. He lifted the false bottom, and underneath was a stack of maps and deeds. "I have not just been trapping all these years, Sarah," Silas said. "I have been planning. I have a claim. A whole valley way up north in the Yukon Territory. There is no law up there, no Pinkertons. It would be just us and the wild." He walked over to her and cupped her face in his big, rough hands. "I promise to keep you safe," he said, "and I aim to keep that promise. But it means leaving all of this behind. The cabin, this life, everything." Sarah looked at the strong walls of the cabin, the only place she had felt safe for years. Then she looked down at Liam. And finally she looked at the scar on Silas's face, and into the gray eyes that looked at her with a kindness that just melted her heart. "Home is not the cabin, Silas," she said softly. "Home is wherever you are." Silas closed his eyes for just a moment, and when he opened them again, the ghost of his dead wife was finally gone. "Pack the mules," Silas said. "We leave at dawn." The journey down from Grizzly Peak felt like a funeral procession for the life they were leaving behind. They were leaving behind. They made their move in the middle of a blinding snow squall, the horses lifting their legs high to get through the deep drifts. Silas rode up front, his eyes constantly searching the white nothingness ahead. Sarah rode Bess, holding on to Liam so tight her arms began to ache. Jericho, looking pale and gritting his teeth with every bump, brought up the rear. They did not stop until they reached the flat country of Montana, weeks later. The scenery had changed from the tight, suffocating pine trees of the mountains to the endless, almost frightening open space of the plains. At a little trading post with no name near the Missouri River, the group finally split. Silas sat Jericho down at a rough-hewn table in the corner of the building. He slid a heavy leather pouch full of gold across the table to the boy. "This will get you all the way to California," Silas said, his voice low. "The weather is warm there, and they have good doctors. You cannot make this trip north with us, kid. That cold will kill you with that shoulder of yours." Jericho looked at the gold for a long moment, then pushed about half of it back across the table. "I only need enough for a train ticket. You keep the rest for the baby." He looked over at Sarah and tried to give her one of his charming smiles, but it came out looking more pained. "You know, if anyone ever asks, I will tell them Silas Mercer and that girl died in an avalanche back in the Bighorns. I saw it with my own 2 eyes." Sarah gave him a hug, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Thank you, Jericho." "Go on now," Jericho whispered, "before this snow clears up." Watching Jericho ride west was the first time Sarah understood just how heavy their banishment truly was. They were like ghosts. From then on, the journey north was a hard, brutal test of their will to survive. They crossed the border into the Canadian territories late in January. The cold up there was like a living creature, a predator that just waited for you to make one single mistake. Silas seemed to change. The mountain man grew even harder, more focused. He would sleep in 10-minute stretches. He hunted with a kind of desperation that Sarah had never seen in him before, but with Sarah he was different. The old lines between employer and servant had been buried back in the snow. One night, as they huddled in a lean-to near the frozen edge of Great Slave Lake, the temperature fell to 40 below. The fire was sputtering out. Silas moved his bedroll right next to hers. "We have to share body heat," he said, his voice rough. "Either that, or we do not wake up." Sarah did not argue. She curled up next to him with her back pressed against his chest. He pulled the heavy bear coat over both of them. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. "Silas," she whispered into the darkness. "Yeah." "Are we chasing a ghost?" she asked him. "Does this valley of yours even really exist?" Silas was quiet for a long while, and his arm tightened just a little around her waist. "It exists. I found it 10 years ago. It is a thermal pocket. There are hot springs. The ground never completely freezes over. It is a place to heal." "You never went back," Sarah pointed out. "I did not have a reason to," Silas murmured, and his breath was warm in her hair. "I do now." The change in their relationship was not some sudden burst of passion. It was more like a slow, steady thaw. It happened when Silas showed her how to shoot the Winchester rifle, his hands carefully guiding hers with great patience. It happened when Sarah mended a tear in his shirt while he was still wearing it, her fingers brushing against the scar on his chest. By the time they finally made it to the Yukon Territory, the spring melt was starting. The rivers were turning into wild floods of ice and muddy water. The very last challenge was the Liard River. It was swollen and angry, and it stood between them and the hidden valley. "We have to swim the horses across," Silas yelled over the roar of the water. "There is not another crossing for 50 miles. Things went wrong when they were about halfway over. A huge log, hidden beneath the churning water, slammed hard into Silas's horse. The animal let out a terrible scream and went under. Silas was thrown into the freezing current. "Silas!" Sarah screamed. She saw his head pop up once, fighting for a breath before the water pulled him down again. Without a second thought, Sarah kicked her horse Bess forward. The mare fought against the current, moving downstream. Sarah did not have a rope. All she had was a long willow branch she had torn from the riverbank. She leaned way out of her saddle, the icy water soaking through her skirts and freezing her legs. "Grab it!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Silas's hand shot out of the water, reaching for anything. He caught the end of the branch. Sarah held on with every bit of strength she had, her muscles burning as the river tried to pull her right out of the saddle. Bess finally found her footing on a gravel bar and pulled them ashore. They collapsed on the far bank, shivering and coughing up river water. Silas just lay on his back, looking up at the gray sky. Sarah crawled over to him and started pounding on his chest. "Breathe! Damn you, Silas Mercer! Breathe!" He coughed, then rolled onto his side and looked at her. His lips were blue with cold, but his eyes were alive. "You swore?" he rasped, and a faint smile touched his lips. "I will do a lot more than swear if you die on me," Sarah sobbed, and she fell down on top of him. Silas's arms wrapped around her, holding her tight. "I am not going anywhere, Sarah. I am not going anywhere." He kissed her. It was a cold, wet kiss that tasted like the river, but it was the most desperate and honest thing Sarah had ever felt in her life. Right there in the middle of the Yukon wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stolen heir, they found something more valuable than the entire Harrington fortune. 2 days after that, they rode through a narrow crack between some granite cliffs and looked down. Below them was a valley, green as an emerald. Steam was rising gently from natural pools of water. Herds of caribou were eating the rich grass. It was so beautiful. It did not seem real. "Home," Silas said. 3 years later, in 1878, the cabin they built in the valley was not a fortress. It was a proper home. It was made of golden cedar and sat close to the hot springs, with a garden out back where Sarah grew potatoes and other hardy vegetables. Liam was almost 4 years old now. He was a wild little boy, always running through the tall grass with a wooden sword, chasing the giant wolf dog that Silas had tamed. He called Silas Pie. He did not know anything about railroads, or Boston, or the bounty on his own head. Sarah stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had filled out, looking healthy, with her skin tanned by the northern sun. She watched Silas chopping wood down by the stream. He moved with a steady rhythm that she knew by heart. They had been safe. The world, it seemed, had forgotten all about them. Or so they had thought. The silence of the valley was broken, not by a gunshot, but by the angry cawing of crows. Silas stopped his chopping. He stood perfectly still, just listening. He walked up to the porch, and his face was grim. "Sarah, get the rifle." "What is it?" Sarah asked, and her heart started hammering with that same old fear from the gilded spur years ago. "Horses," Silas said. "A lot of them coming through the pass. They were not supposed to be found. Jericho had done his job well. The story of their deaths had been believed, but it turned out that pure hatred was a better tracker than greed ever was. Riders came out of the pass. There were 10 of them. The man in the lead was not Concede. He was long dead. It was a man in a black suit that looked plain ridiculous out here in the wild, with a group of hard-faced mercenaries on either side of him. It was Archibald Harrington, the uncle. He had spent 3 years and a small fortune chasing after ghosts, driven by the fear that the true heir might one day come back to take over the company. They rode up to the cabin and formed a half-circle. Silas stood on the porch with the Winchester resting in the crook of his arm. Sarah stood right next to him, holding a shotgun in her hands. She pushed Liam behind her legs. "Mr. Mercer," Harrington said, his voice thin and full of greed, "you are a very hard man to find." "Get off my land," Silas said, his voice steady and calm. "Your land?" Harrington let out a dry, cracking laugh. "This territory is not even on a map. It belongs to no one. Just like that boy belongs to no one." He pointed a gloved finger right at Liam. "I do not want to fight, Mercer. I just want to tie up a loose end. Give me the boy. You and the woman can keep this little paradise of yours." Silas looked at the 10 men. They were armed to the teeth with repeaters and long-range rifles. It was a firing squad. "You know I cannot do that," Silas said. "Then you will die." Harrington shrugged. "Kill them." The mercenaries all raised their rifles. "Now!" Silas roared. He did not shoot at the men. He fired at the ground, right at a pile of dry brush he had set up 50 yards to the left. Hidden inside was a blasting cap from his old mining supplies. Boom! The explosion was not meant to kill anybody. It was meant to cause chaos. The horses, terrified by the sudden blast of thunder, reared up and bucked wildly. The whole formation of riders fell apart. "Run!" Silas yelled to Sarah, but they did not run away. They ran straight into the steam the hot springs created a thick, natural bank of fog near the eastern cliffs. Silas and Sarah, after grabbing Liam, disappeared into that white mist. "After them!" Harrington screamed, fighting to get his own horse under control. "Flush them out!" The mercenaries jumped off their horses and charged into the steam. It was a slaughter, but it was not the one that Harrington had planned. That steam was Silas's world. It blinded the attackers, it muffled their hearing, and it split them all up. Silas moved through it like a ghost. He did not use the rifle. The fighting was too close for that. He used his knife. He used the land itself. A mercenary would see a shadow, fire his gun, and find nothing there. A thing. That was when Silas would make his move from the shadows. But Sarah, she wasn't about to stand by. She tucked Liam away in a little steam vent, a hidey hole they'd set up for just this kind of awful day. Then she doubled back, getting the drop on the men hunting her husband. She saw one of them drawing a bead on Silas's back. She didn't think twice. She let that shotgun roar. The kickback put a mean bruise on her shoulder, but the fella went down hard. One after another, those hired guns fell to the phantoms in the mist. Before long, quiet settled back over the steam fields. The only thing you could hear was the gentle bubbling of the water. Silas stepped out of the fog, his knife dripping red and his chest working hard for air. He found Sarah down by the cave, safe and sound. "Where's Harrington?" Silas demanded. They started walking back to the cabin as the mist began to burn off. And there he was, Archibald Harrington, sitting all by his lonesome on his horse. His men were either dead or had tucked tail and run. He had a pistol in his hand, but it was shaking so bad he couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. Silas just walked right toward him. He didn't even bother to raise his own weapon. He walked straight up to that horse, reached up, and yanked Harrington clean out of the saddle. That rich fella landed in the mud with a sorry-sounding splat. He tried to crawl backward, his eyes wide with fear at the big scarred man standing over him. "Please," Harrington whimpered like a kicked pup. "I can give you twice the fortune, anything you want." Silas just looked down at him with nothing but pure contempt. "You came 3,000 miles to put an end to a child. There ain't enough gold in this whole world to buy your way out of this." Silas raised his knife. "Silas, don't!" Sarah's voice cut right through his fury. Silas froze solid. He turned and saw Sarah walking toward him, holding little Liam's hand. "You can't do this," she said, her voice steady. "Not in front of our boy." Silas laid eyes on Liam. The child was just standing there, watching everything. Silas sucked in a long, deep breath, and the fire in his veins slowly cooled down. He lowered the knife. He grabbed Harrington by his fancy collar and hauled him to his feet. "You're gonna get out of here," Silas growled. "You're gonna walk back over that pass with no horse, no gun, and no food." "That's a death sentence," Harrington cried out. "The wolves, the cold." "It's a chance," Silas told him. "More of a chance than you gave that boy." He gave Harrington a hard shove toward the cliffs. "Start walking, and if I ever see your face again, I won't wait for my wife to stop me." Archibald Harrington, the so-called railroad king, stumbled off into that great lonely Yukon wilderness. Nobody ever saw or heard from him again. About 6 months down the road, a traveling priest who'd gotten himself lost on the way to the Klondike happened upon their valley. He found a cabin filled with a warm fire, good food, and the sound of laughter. He ended up staying for supper. Later that evening, with the firelight dancing, he went ahead and performed a little ceremony. They didn't have any guests, just the mountains and the stars looking down. Silas Mercer took Sarah Miller's hand. His own hand, all scarred and calloused, shook just a little as he slipped a simple ring he'd hammered out of a gold nugget right onto her finger. "Do you?" the priest asked. "I do," Silas said, looking at Sarah like she was the only sunrise he'd ever see. "And do you?" Sarah looked at the man who had paid for her just to set her free. The man who had taken on the whole world for her. the man who was now her family. "I do," she whispered. They never did go back to the civilized world. The Harrington fortune, well, it ended up going to the States since nobody ever came to claim it. Liam grew up strong and wild, a true man of the mountains, never even knowing he'd traded a fancy cage for a whole kingdom of open sky and endless wilderness. And in the evenings, whenever the wind would howl through that pass, Silas would pull Sarah in close by the fire, and they'd tell the story. Not the one about the sail, or the gold, or all the blood that was shed. They'd tell the story of how two folks, both a little broken, found each other in the middle of the snow and built a love strong enough to get through any storm. That, my friends, is the incredible story of Silas and Sarah. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes family ain't about the blood you share, but about who you're willing to bleed for. It proves that even when you're at your lowest, treated like property, there's always a chance for a new start, and a love that can conquer anything. Silas Mercer wasn't just some mountain man. He was a protector who showed the world that a father is made by the love in his heart, not by blood. If this story warmed your heart, please go on and hit that like button. It truly does help this channel grow for all y'all. Share this video with somebody who you know believes in a love that lasts. And don't you forget to subscribe and ring that little bell so you never miss one of our stories from the Wild West. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch y'all on the next one.